How's it going, everybody? It's Warren. Welcome back to the Cosmic Wonder, where we talk all things Marvel and MCU. And if you're here, you probably watched Hawkeye Episode 5. And if you didn't, I'm gonna go ahead and give you a spoiler warning because I want to jump right into this. Kingpin is finally in the MCU. And the best part is it's Vinny D. It's Vincent D'Onofrio. He is back reprising his role as Kingpin. Now, right off the bat, I don't think this is going to be the same character from the Netflix series. Yes, it's Kingpin. Yes, it's D'Onofrio. But I doubt they're keeping the stories from the Netflix series in the MCU. Those aren't canon. It seemed like Kevin Feige pretty much made that clear, so they're basically going to reboot the character but keep the same actor that played him. And Kevin Feige recently mentioned this about Daredevil. He said that if and when Daredevil does come to the MCU, Matt Murdock, Charlie Cox would indeed be playing him. And since he said that, and since Kingpin is now in the MCU and we are getting an Echo series, I'm assuming Daredevil is not too far behind, so be excited about that as well. But let's break down this ending and what exactly is going on in the Hawkeye series and what we can expect from the finale next week. And also, my giveaway is still going on. We've chosen about 12 winners so far, still a ton of stuff to give away. So be sure to subscribe and check the pinned comment and description for your ways to enter. Now, as myself and many of you, pretty much everybody, suspected, Eleanor is indeed not exactly good. To start off, she has clearly framed Jack, unfortunately. In the beginning of the show, Jack was really made to kind of appear like a villain. However, they were pretty obvious and in your face about it, which usually means it's a distraction from what's actually going on, which we have now found out. Eleanor is actually working for Kingpin, or with him. And just as I suspected from the last episode, Jack has no idea about Sloan. As he stated in this episode, he's never heard of that company, and he makes a joke, even though it is actually very serious, stating that he's never worked a day in his life because he was kind of born into money. Now, the only reason this happens is because Kate tells her mother that her and Hawkeye figured this out. So Eleanor, who is most likely Madame Mask, which we'll talk about in a bit, knows that Hawkeye is going to be gunning for her. So what does she do? She goes ahead and calls the cops on Jack, who unfortunately is indeed a patsy like I talked about in my last breakdown and is simply a person who is kind of love blind right now with Eleanor. So unfortunately he takes the fall for Eleanor and he doesn't know it's Eleanor. Meanwhile, Yelena gives Kate a visit. He goes to her old apartment where Yelena is waiting for her, and they have what Yelena calls a girls' night. Yelena, of course, knows that Kate Bishop isn't a bad person. She believes in Hawkeye, but Yelena thinks that Hawkeye is bad. She believes that he is responsible for the death of her sister. This is most likely due to Val, who was introduced in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier and in the post-credit scene of Black Widow, telling Yelena that Clint was responsible for the death of Natasha. Now, Yelena seems pretty set in her ways, but Kate does seemingly convince her that maybe there is more to Hawkeye than she actually knows. Maybe Hawkeye actually is a good person who cared for Natasha. Kate says you need to do some research looking into who hired you to take out Hawkeye, which again, we'll talk about in just a bit. But the final piece to the puzzle of this ending that you need to know is what happens with Clint and Maya. Clint visits the Avengers Shrine where he goes and takes his earpiece out so he can have silence and talk to Natasha. You can tell that her death still haunts him as he tried himself to be the one that would be sacrificed for the Soul Stone, but in the end it was her and he still is haunted by it. But the last thing he does before he leaves the shrine is apologize to her. And in this scene with Maya and Clint, it becomes very clear what he is apologizing for. He is apologizing for becoming Ronin again. He was Ronin during the 5-year gap where he went on a killing spree. Granted, he was killing bad people, but a killing spree nonetheless, but Natasha came and found him and pulled him out of it. He was Ronin no more because of her, so he apologizes to her for becoming Ronin again. Now, as Ronin, he visits Maya, and he takes out everybody, so it's just her and him. And here's where he drops a really big bomb on Maya. Now, after defeating her, he shows his face to her, so she realizes that it's Hawkeye, it's the Avenger, and he quickly says that if you come after me again, or my family, it'll be the last thing you do. Obviously, because he'll kill her. Then he says that you and I, we're the same. She says, no, you are a monster. Speaking of what he did as Ronin, specifically about him killing her dad. However, I'm still not so sure he did, which I'll talk about. Clint says we're both weapons, but when we're filled with rage, we're blind. And here's where we kind of start to see the story all come together. Clint says that this rage makes you blind, which means you can be used and manipulated. And this is where Clint drops the bomb. He says, I was there that night. tipped off by an informant who works for your boss. He says your boss wanted your father dead. Now he's using you. Now, of course, Maya doesn't believe him, or she doesn't want to believe him. But now it's all actually lining up with the comic storyline pretty accurately. And this is where we'll connect everything. Maya meets back up with Qazi and asks him a very important question. Why wasn't he there that night when everybody else is? He doesn't really have an answer. He says, I don't know, I just didn't get the call. But my theory is that he might have been dressed up as Ronin. Now, I acknowledge this could be wrong. Hawkeye was in a rough time and he was taking out bad people, and technically the Tracksuit Mafia are bad people. So Hawkeye still could very well be the person that killed Maya's father, but where was Qazi? Now, it could be that Kingpin just didn't want him there so he wouldn't die. That, of course, makes sense. But I'm wondering if Qazi is the one who killed Maya's father. In the comics, he is very, very ruthless, and he's kind of the main one that Hawkeye fights against, which isn't really what we're seeing here, but of course, we'll wait and see. But Hawkeye actually does convince Maya that something's going on, which is why she asked Qazi where he was. And based off of how she leaves, she clearly understands that things aren't as they seem. Now, her boss is obviously Kingpin. This is revealed when Yelena sends Kate Bishop a text message. She actually took her advice and tracked down who hired her, and as it turns out, it was Eleanor Bishop, Kate's mother. So here's what happened, and this is kind of the big picture. In the photo that Yelena sends, we see Eleanor with Kingpin. Hawkeye confirms that's who I was worried about. He was worried about him because obviously he has dealt with him in the past. Obviously Ronin has dealt with him and took out a lot of the Tracksuit Mafia. Now Eleanor is clearly one of the bad guys, and she is most likely Madame Mask, who works with Kingpin in the comics. Kingpin is in charge of the Tracksuit Mafia. He is their boss, and he's Qazi's boss. This is straight from the comics as well. Kingpin employs the Tracksuit Mafia, he employs Qazi, and he also looks after Echo after her father dies in the comics. But in the comics, Kingpin is actually the one that kills her father. Now, eventually, she figures this out with the help of Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil. Obviously, that part's not going to be the same here. Hawkeye is really the one that is showing her that her boss Kingpin is actually a bad guy, and it looks like he is responsible for her father's death. So everything is really coming together here. Now, Eleanor clearly realized that Hawkeye was going to be a problem because Hawkeye and her daughter Kate were looking into some things that they shouldn't be looking into, like the Sloan Company, that's under Jack's name, that does money laundering for the Tracksuit Mafia, which Kingpin is in charge of. So Eleanor calls Kingpin, and what do they decide to do? Hire a Black Widow assassin to take out Hawkeye before Hawkeye gets in the middle of all of their business. Now, it's unclear on whether or not Kingpin knows that Hawkeye is Ronin. It's irrelevant because Kingpin would want to kill Hawkeye for meddling anyways. And maybe he even likes Ronin. He said he was tipped off by an informant, and he said that your boss wanted your dad dead. So was the informant the boss, Kingpin, or was the informant Qazi? That's going to be what's revealed in the final episode. Now, keep in mind that we're going to be going into the Echo series, and Kingpin will indeed be in the Echo series, and reportedly, Daredevil will be as well. So there are some things that aren't going to be really wrapped up here, but hopefully they have a really, really good ending. I'm worried that there actually is so much to wrap up that we're going to be left on a cliffhanger for some. But pretty much that's what's going on. Eleanor and Kingpin are working together. They control the Tracksuit Mafia. Eleanor is probably Madame Mask. They hired a Black Widow assassin to kill Hawkeye because Hawkeye is meddling. Val, when she gave Yelena the job, lied to her and told her that Hawkeye was responsible for her sister's death, which isn't completely untrue, but it is a wide stretch of the truth. And Yelena will most likely realize this and eventually help Hawkeye and Kate. Now, the only thing that we really don't know about yet is the watch. Who does the Rolex belong to? Does it belong to Laura? And who is she? Is she Mockingbird, a former agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Did she work for Kingpin before? We don't know that yet, but of course, that should be revealed in next week's episode, but we'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, let me know what you thought about this episode of Hawkeye. Rate it 1 out of 10 down below. And of course, don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe for more Marvel content. And as always, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter for live updates. And of course, thank you all so much for watching. Woof woof.